And now, from Nashville Public Television's Studio A, celebrating authors, literature, and ideas for more than 3 decades, this is A Word on Words with John Seigenthaler.
Hello, I'm John Seigenthaler. Welcome once again to A Word on Words. My guest today is John F. Baker, Jr. He's a descendant of slaves. He spent 30 years researching his ancestors, and he's written a book about not only his own family, but about the history of hundreds of slaves. Washington of Wessyngton Plantation is an uplifting story of survival and family. John, welcome to A Word on Words.
Thank you very much.
It's great to have you here to talk about this story, and I learned so much from reading about this gigantic plantation. It was located right here in Middle Tennessee, largest tobacco plantation in the nation, maybe in the world.
Right.
And the George A. Washington, who owned it and operated it, came over from Virginia and was a distant relative of the George Washington, first president of the United States. And all of that makes it a fascinating story. But the research you've done, 30 years of research on this, is that accurate?
Yeah, that's accurate.
Talk about that.
Okay, when I was a 7th grader, there was a photograph of 4 former slaves in our social studies textbook called Your Tennessee. And in one of the chapters...
Jesse Burt wrote Your Tennessee.
Right, exactly. Yeah. I came to see this photograph, and it always fascinated me, and I looked at it, and it seemed like I should know the people in the photograph. I later found out from my maternal grandmother that these were actually her grandparents.
You called her Big Mama.
I call her Big Mama. My grandmother moved to Chicago in the 1940s, and each summer she'd come home and visit us. And on one visit, she went to the home of her elder brother. And so she called my mother and told her to have me to bring a camera because she had something she wanted me to copy. And I said, "What does Big Mama want me to copy, Mama?" And she said, "Just get the camera, we'll see when we get there." So when we got there, she showed me a newspaper clipping from our local newspaper, the Robertson County Times. I think it was the plantation's 150th or 60th anniversary, and they had a photograph of the white Washington family and our family, and it listed all their names there. So when my grandmother showed me the photograph in the newspaper, I said, "Grandmother," I said, "who is this?" I said, "This
same photograph you've seen in your
I'd always
7th grade.
seen. I said, "This photograph is in our history book." And she said, "Well, the couple seated were my grandparents, and my grandfather was the cook on the Washington plantation, and that's where we got the Washington surname." So I became totally fascinated from that point on. I could hardly wait to get back to school.
We're going to show our viewers that picture a little bit later on in the program.
Okay.
And I must say that the book is packed full of interesting photographs from those days. This plantation, George A. Washington, he owns more than that 15,000 acres in Robertson County. He owns other farms elsewhere, and he has slaves on those farms too. You know, it occurred to me as I was reading, so many slave owners in those tragic days said, "You know, I don't separate families." James K. Polk claimed that. But of course, if you own plantations as Polk did and as Washington did in 3 different locations, you've got the family all together, except one of them may be in another county.
Right.
And beyond that, I read again and again how many single slaves he bought, sometimes children, 2 little girls. I mean, that, in effect, is breaking up a family. So we don't want to make it appear as, while he might have been more benign than most slave owners, it was a vicious, tragic cycle that went on generation after generation. Right. And you explain it so well.
Well, the earliest family, the 2 girls you mentioned, were actually my ancestors. My great-great-great-grandmother's name was Jenny, and she was born in Sussex County, Virginia in 1792. Her sister came to Tennessee with Joseph Washington as well. She was born in 1790. And they were originally owned by the Blow family. And Colonel Michael Blow on their parents, grandparents, extended family. He passed away in 1797, and one of his sons got 14 of the slaves. Micajah Blow, exactly. And in a few years, he became heavily indebted, and he mortgaged some of the land he had inherited, and he sold my great-great-great-grandmother and her sister to Joseph Washington.
And you have a little bill of sale, a reproduction of bill of sale from Micajah for that sale.
Right. And so Joseph Washington brought them from Virginia to Tennessee, and that's how our family got here. And we've had 10 generations of our family in the same county since that time.
And I will tell you, as I read the life of George Washington, as you set it out here, I do get a sense that there was empathy for slaves, particularly some of those who were in your family seemed to have real affection for them. On the other hand, he was not above whipping slaves. And whatever the life, as you point out again and again, they despised it despite the fact that he and his wife may well have thought they were giving them a better existence than they might otherwise have had. Notice that you have charts in there. There's one that reflects punishment, discipline given to the slaves. There's another one that sort of traces the DNA to determine where these people who became slaves came from. Yes. And Nigeria seemed to be one of the places,
main ports that they were taken from.
That Nigeria, Cameroon, Niger, seems to me that they primarily kidnapped from their tribal homes, transported to Virginia, and from there, Washington comes over and establishes this gigantic plantation. First, very small, wasn't it?
Yes, it was. I think he had 640 acres at first, and then he married Mary Cheatham, and he got more holdings from her father, and later he purchased more acreage. Yeah,
and Mary Cheatham, his wife, he had an interesting family life. His father-in-law turned out to be a great friend of Andrew Jackson.
Exactly.
William
B. Lewis.
William Berkeley Lewis, yeah.
That was George's father-in-law.
Yes, George Washington's father-in-law.
George A. Washington.
Yeah, yes. George A. Washington. So, and that's another generation. I mean, the plantation has grown, booming.
All right.
Talk about a little bit your research. It starts with that conversation with Big Mama, almost.
Right.
You stay up all night questioning her.
Yes. I asked my grandmother a lot of questions and my great-uncle because my grandmother was the youngest child in her family, and she didn't really know her grandparents personally.
Great-uncle was Bob?
Bob Washington was her brother, and he actually knew both of his grandparents. So when they showed me the photograph, they told me that direct descendants of the plantation owners still lived at the Wessyngton Mansion. So the next morning, bright and early, I called out there and I spoke to Ann Consalvin Tabbitt, who was a sixth-generation descendant of Joseph Washington. And I told her that I'd seen the newspaper article, and I was a descendant of Emmanuel and Henry Washington. And she told me that the family had deposited all their records in the Tennessee State Library and Archives, and I was invited out to Wessyngton and to take a look at some of the artifacts.
She ran a bookstore, as I remember, in Springfield, and was very kind in opening up everything she had. Right.
She ran a bookstore in Springfield, so I met her there for the first time, and she showed me a list of the slaves' births on the plantation starting in 1795 up to 1860.
And that's in there, too. Right. That's in your book, that list.
Exactly. And in that document, in those documents, I found my great-great-grandfather's exact date of birth, as well as his wife and other family members. She then invited me out to the plantation, and the next day my mother took me out there. And so as a small child, my grandfather had taken me riding out in the country nearly every Sunday. And when I was maybe 5 or 6 years old, we passed by the gates at Wessyngton, and my grandfather pointed and said, "That's Washington. That's where your people came from on your mother's side of the family."
And your family pronounced it Washington Plantation, but it was Wessyngton
It's called
Plantation.
Wessyngton.
That's what he named. Now, your grandfather who took you on those trips, Joe Cobbs, that's right. You let Big Mama and Bob and some other relatives help you tell this story. It's almost, in those early pages of the book, you help them provide an oral history,
right,
verbatim accounts of what their memories are.
Exactly.
Then later on, you take over the telling, and not too much later on, you take over the telling. Mm-hmm. Talk about the writing process. How did you get this book into shape? You're doing all this research, you're picking up these anecdotes, wonderful, sometimes sad, sometimes joyful, sometimes tragic stories. You're collecting all of this material. You're talking to dozens, and then I count 90 plus separate interviews you did mostly with your relatives. Mm-hmm. How do you take all of that and turn it into this book, The Washingtons of Wessyngton Plantation?
Okay. When I first started the research, there were probably 25 persons that were from 80 years old to 170 years old whose ancestors had come from Wessyngton. So I interviewed all these people, and over years I collected more and more interviews, and then at the same time I was conducting research in the Tennessee State Library and Archives, and many of these documents supported the oral history. I also interviewed some of the descendants of the plantation owners. So when I started to write the book, I tried to put it in a chronological order and then work the interviews in there to give it more life.
I learned so much from the book. You talk about the role of the overseer of the slave. Now, he is employed by the owner of the plantation. And you talk about the trap the overseer is quite often caught in. On the one hand, if he brutalizes the slaves, the slave owner says, you've been damaging my property. If he is too soft on the slaves, the slave owner says, you're not getting enough out of my property. I want them to produce more. That's one set of circumstances. Mm-hmm. He's also caught, as you point out, in another bind in dealing with the slaves themselves. If he has sexual relations with a slave or accepts favors from them, he then gives them the opportunity to take advantage of him on one hand. If on the other, rather than being friendly or overly friendly or sexually friendly, if on the other hand he's brutal to them, they can make his life miserable, and some of them are close to the owner of the slaves, and some of them talk to the slave owner about, I got no sympathy for overseers, but you do put them in that trap, and I saw the overseer in a new light for the first time. Talk a little bit about where that came from, that material about the role of the overseer.
Well, I tried to define every facet of life on the plantation, including the slave owners, the Africans who were enslaved that worked in the house, those that worked in the field, to get a broad perspective from everyone's viewpoint, so to speak.
Well, for those of you who just turned in, I'm talking to John Baker Jr. About his book, Washingtons of Wessyngton Plantation. Part of the book is a fantastic photo album. I mean, you go from page to page to page, and the pictures are there. And I'd like for you to look at the screen now, and let's share some of those photographs with our audience, and you can tell us who we're looking at and what we're looking at. And that's the photograph. That's the cover of the book, and that's the 7th grade picture.
Yes. Seated was my great-great-grandfather, Emmanuel Washington, and he was born there in 1824. Seated on the right was my great-great-grandmother, Henny Washington. She was born there in 1839. Both are buried in the slave cemetery at Wessyngton. Standing left was Allen Washington. He was the head dairyman on the plantation, and he was born there in 1825. Standing to the right was Granville Washington. He was born there in 1831, and he was the valet of the owner of the plantation, George Augustine Washington.
He was also the son of George Washington.
And said to be the son of George Augustine Washington.
And you have elsewhere in the book, we won't look at it now, but there's a picture of George and a picture of Granville, and the resemblance is unmistakable. Yeah. There it is. That's the house itself.
Yes, this was a Wessyngton mansion. It was started in 1815 and completed in 1819. One person that I interviewed was Maddie Terry when I first started the research, and she was 93 years old at the time. Her great-grandmother, Sarah Washington Cheatham, was born at Wessyngton in 1810, and she lived to be 104 years old. And she told her great-granddaughter that she remembered as a child, she and the other slave children collecting clay from the creek bank to bring up on the hill where Wessyngton now stands, and the adults molded and made the bricks to complete the construction of the mansion.
We have a more recent picture. That's the same house.
Yes, this is the
expanded and modernized.
This is the Wessyngton Mansion in the 1970s.
Yes. And then when you look at, well, let's look at some more photographs. I found them fascinating.
This was Fannie and Wesley Williams. After emancipation, they, as well as many other African Americans close to Wessyngton and white families, came to Wessyngton and sharecropped. The
one thing about, and that's lovely, that's the plantation, that's the tobacco.
Yes. This is a tobacco field, and in 1860, Wessyngton was the largest tobacco plantation in America, and the second largest in the world.
And that?
Next is a photograph of a former slave, Sarah Jane Harris. In the middle is my great-great-grandfather, Emmanuel Washington, and to the right is my great-great-grandmother, Henny Washington.
Man and Henny, we've seen him in the other picture,
right.
But this is a separate.
Yes, and this was taken in the late 1800s. This is a monument that was placed in the slave cemetery on Wessyngton Plantation, and we guess that there, or estimate that there's over 200 people buried there. This is a view of some of the former slave cabins on Wessyngton Plantation, and this was in the early 1900s. This was a portrait painted by Maria Howard Whedon of my great-great-grandfather, Emmanuel Washington, and this was painted in the late 1800s.
She was a famous painter.
1900s. Yes. She was a famous painter.
And that's man.
Yeah, that's man.
Again. I don't, oh yeah, there's the family tree. Are there 275 names on that family tree?
No, there are over 600 names on this family tree, and these are direct descendants of my great-great-grandfather and mother, Emmanuel and Henny Washington.
Amazing progenies, more than 600.
Yes, and that's just one family. I've done the same thing for every family from the plantation.
Well, again, talk about prodigious research. The charts are one thing, the photographs are fantastic, but the human element of the slave culture, as you define it in the book, is gripping, and at times there are moments of humor, but most of it is depressing. To think about a society that enslaved, a society that, or a landowner who enslaved, who became wealthy off the sweat and sometimes the blood of people who were expected to respect and have affection for them. And part of the story you deal with has to do with the natural, it seems to me, the natural rebellion that occurred from time to time, and how that rebellion was dealt with by punishment. There were times when slaves were accused of murdering their masters. And you recite 3 cases. I remember one involved Ned. Ned, the first African-American hanged in Robertson County. And then there was a story of a woman accused of killing her mistress. And she goes on trial, and there's a hung jury. And she goes on trial again, and there's another hung jury. And then somehow the system breaks down, and another judge gets that case and says, well, they've acted twice on it, they're not going to prosecute her again, but they give her 100 lashes, 10 per day. I mean, it's hard to understand how this society could have survived without a massive slave rebellion. Nat Turner should have happened at times like that, right here on this plantation in our own Middle Tennessee.
This is true.
What's going on in your mind while you're reading about this culture of which your family is so intimately a part?
It's amazing that they survived everything that they went through in plantation slavery. So they must have been undoubtedly very strong people. And I'm sure their faith in God helped them to endure those times.
Well, you write about churches, and you talk about education and the religious life, and you wonder if it hadn't been for that faith, how they could have endured it. And of course, some could not. Then you come to that period of war, and some of the slaves bail out, join the Union Army.
Right.
Others are caught in the trap, can't get away. Comes emancipation. You take us through the war, and you take us to emancipation. I was astounded to find out how well George did after the war. He made investments. It turned out to be a millionaire all over again. Much of the South, it was a different story. The owner of the plantation was ruined by the war and wiped out. Somehow he survived.
Well, he traveled back and forth to New York, and he invested heavily in stocks and bonds, and that's one of the reasons that he was so successful after the war. Actually, he was wealthier after the war than he was before.
That's right. Now, let's talk about post-emancipation and what happened then to some of those slaves, former slaves.
Okay. Some of the former slaves moved to Nashville. Many of them moved to Dixon and Cheatham and surrounding counties. Many of them moved up north. Some went to Indiana, some Illinois, and dispersed from there all over the country. Many of the former slaves returned to the plantation for the first generation. Later, some of them actually purchased land that had once been a part of the Wessyngton Plantation, and some of that land is still in their descendants' ownership today. There are several hundred descendants still living in Robertson County from the African Americans that were enslaved at Wessyngton.
I'm fascinated by this series of reunions that the families have had. What's the genesis of that? What holds them together? What brings them back together?
All the Washingtons in our family have always had very close family ties, and we've been having a Washington family reunion probably 60 years at least. So we get together every year, and in 2000, I took our family to Wessyngton as part of the family reunion.
Talk about that, would you? That visit to Wessyngton with all of those people?
Yeah, several hundred people attended this reunion. We had many relatives who had moved up north, and this was the first time our families had been reunited since they left Wessyngton. We had as many as 6 generations of our Washington family there. And my great aunt at the time was 97, and there were 6 generations of her family.
You know, I talked about moments of humor, and I'm not sure how funny this account is, but you talk about there was some stealing that went on from time to time, and slaves were punished for stealing. And you talk about the different attitude Thomas Jefferson had, who had slaves, and George Washington had, who had slaves. And Jefferson said, you know,
he could understand
not surprising.
why.
Yeah,
yes.
Not surprising. I mean, they produced much of this. Maybe they thought it belonged to them.
Right. The slaves viewed this as taking. Since they produced everything, they felt that they were entitled to it.
Washington says absolutely.
Yeah, President George Washington couldn't understand that.
Absolutely not. I mean, they're supposed to be honest people. Look, you got them enslaved, George. Don't you understand it? Yeah. Interesting to me how Jefferson and Washington looked at that problem, and a real problem, differently. Right. I mean, the dishonesty was there, the stealing was there. The punishment was different, though, in each case. And there are other historical references in the book that just that really give you insights. I get insights from this book, much as I've read on
You've paid close attention to everything in there.
I have,
see.
but you know, you cite Alex Haley and roots. I learned more from this, from your book, The Washingtons of Wessyngton Plantation, than I learned from reading my friend Alex Haley's book, on called Roots, which was a national bestseller, and we had week after week. Well, you've done this now, and you've gotten a book published. You got an agent who said, yes, this book will sell. And now the question is, we have just about a minute and a half left. What's next? You going to write another book?
I think what will happen, many descendants that I wouldn't have any way to contact otherwise, this will bring many of them out. They'll have photographs, they'll have stories, and I'll probably be able to do a follow-up on those families.
And what would you do with that? How would you carry the story on?
I would probably pick it up in the early 1900s and bring it forward to the present generation.
So that it would not be a slave story, but it would be how
they progressed.
And how after Reconstruction, when we go through resegregation,
right,
that would be a story of how you survive segregation, I guess.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah. Well, it's been great to have you here.
Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you so much for coming. I thank all of you for watching. I'm John Seigenthaler. For A Word on Words, keep reading.